Thank you to the Bombay Catholic Sabha and to Alex D'Souza for inviting me. I'm a member of a small collective called Campaign Against Hate Speech. And in the Campaign Against Hate Speech is a collective which comprises lawyers, researchers, activists, professionals and students. We came together with the objective of challenging and confronting hate speech by traditional news media and on social media, and most importantly by politicians. Now, part of our efforts have been directed towards documenting hate speech and filing complaints against regulatory authorities, filing complaints with regulatory authorities such as the Press Council of India, the News Broadcasting Standards Association, and with media monitoring authorities. Now, our other effort has been directed towards producing a report called The Wages of Hate, Journalism in Dark Times. In this report, we document patterns of hate speech in Kannada media, but also we provide a framework for understanding what exactly constitutes hate speech and how it does not fall under the scope of freedom of expression, and also as to why it is important to confront and challenge hate speech. Now, I have two parts to my presentation. And the first part of my presentation today, I'll focus on key arguments that we are making in this report on hate speech. The first argument we make is on what exactly constitutes hate speech. Now, it's a term that's been used quite loosely. We don't exactly have clarity on what constitutes hate speech, what constitutes offensive speech, and how do we distinguish between the two. So in our report, we actually try to define what constitutes hate speech, and we draw from legal scholars who and argue in our report that hate speech is not about one individual per se, but it is about that individual as a member of a group, and a process which an American scholar called Jeremy Waldron terms as group defamation. Now, such forms of defamation can take the form of a supposedly factual claim, such as Muslims are terrorists or guns, crime, and drugs are typical of Negroes. These are group defamatory statements, but group defamation can also take the form of a characterization that denigrates the group, such as, say, lack of merit, quote unquote merit among Dalits and Adivasis who avail of affirmative action programs. In some other cases, hate speech attacks the normative basis of equality through dehumanizing metaphors, where individuals and communities are compared with non-human species such as dogs, insects, or through the use of specific casteist insults used to humiliate, such as bhangi or chamar for Dalits or chakka for transgender persons. Finally, in some other cases, defamation can go beyond facts or moral opinion to actually advocate discrimination, exclusion, and even calls for social and economic boycott, such as, say, Go Back to Pakistan, which is directed most often towards Indian Muslims in particular. Now, our second argument about hate speech is that it undermines the equal membership of citizens that is guaranteed to all individuals under the Indian Constitution. So now it undermines the equal membership of citizens belonging to different communities or groups. Now, these groups are often defined on the basis of certain socio-political identities, such as caste, gender, sexual orientation, race, linguistic identity, ethnicity, etc. For instance, sexist hate speech relates to expressions which spread, incite, promote, justify hatred based on sex. Some groups of women are particularly targeted by such sexist hate speech, notably young women, women in media, or women politicians. And we all have no choice but to know of the kind of media coverage around actresses and so-called drug mafia on TV channels. And such forms of speech can also become part of, such hate speech can also be directed towards groups with a political ideology. And in our report, we see that this is directed towards this constructed category called the anti-national, which emerged most prominently during the anti-CAA protests. During the period of lockdown, we also saw that hate speech was directed towards the Blighi Jamaat members, but while hate speech was directed towards this particular sect, it was the equal membership of Muslims within the larger nation that was threatened, undermined, and questioned. Now, our third argument is around the implications of hate speech. Now, the Indian Supreme Court has recognized the constitutional implications of hate speech in one particular case called the Pravasi Bhalai Sangathan versus the Union of India. And in that, the Supreme Court has said, and I quote, hate speech rises beyond causing distress to individual group members. It can have a societal impact. Hate speech lays the ground for later broad attacks on the vulnerable that can range from discrimination to ostracism, segregation, deportation, violence, and in the most extreme cases, to genocide. Now, hate speech also impacts a protected group's ability to respond to these substantive ideas under debate, thereby placing a serious barrier to their full participation in our democracy. Now, that's the Supreme Court of India talking about hate speech. Now, in our report, we look back into history as well to further advance this argument that hate speech is a step along the way for eventual calls for genocide of targeted communities. We draw from examples of hateful media coverage, which in Germany under the Nazi rule aided in the killing of millions of Jews, and in Rwanda, where millions of Tutsis were killed by the Hutus. Now, finally, we may have often heard arguments that hate speech is covered under the right to freedom of expression guaranteed to all of us under the Indian Constitution. Now, of course, the value of free speech in a democracy is immense, and it's undisputed that democracy thrives on disagreements, provided they do not cross the boundaries of civil discourse. And critical and dissenting voices are crucial for a vibrant society. Now, this kind of speech, there's also a speech that offends, shocks, and disturbs, and this is included within the ambit of freedom of expression. While such speech, that is speech that offends, shocks, and disturbs, can hurt sentiments of individuals, groups, and communities, it can be countered either legally through defamation suits or through counter speech. That is speech that challenges this offensive speech, or another way is positive speech. That is speech that promotes positive attributes and tries to negate this power of offensive speech. But it is very important to recognize that hate speech is very different from speech that offends, shocks, and disturbs. And this imperative for regulating hate speech comes from our own constitution, which says that the liberty of free speech cannot be absolute or uncontrolled. Now, Article 19, which guarantees to us citizens the the right to freedom of expression, also imposes reasonable restrictions. And some of these restrictions to freedom of speech and expression are when it violates the security of the state and sovereignty and integrity of India, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency or morality, or in relation to contempt of court, defamation, or incitement to an offense. Now, how do we define these vague terms such as decency or morality, since they're so subjective? Now, in this, a legal scholar called Gautam Bhatia has argued that the underlying vision that supports some of our important speech laws is not public morality or individual morality, but constitutional morality. And it's important that constitutional morality be protected, and in protecting constitutional morality, it's important that hate speech be prohibited because it ends up denying the right to equality, non-discrimination, and dignity of a vulnerable minority. Now, the second part of my presentation focuses on Kannada media. Now, we looked at Kannada media not because it's in some ways, because it's in any way more worse or better than other regional media or English media, but we used Kannada media as an illustration of the kinds of patterns that you can see within news media. So the campaign against hate speech started off by focusing on the provocative and misogynistic coverage of anti-CAA protests in Karnataka, especially because there are charges of seditions sedition had been filed against female anti-CAA protesters and against Kashmiri students in a North Karnataka town for allegedly making a video that hailed a neighboring country. Now, there were instances of anti-CAA protesters arrested for simply holding placards up in protest venues, and the media was smearing them with labels such as anti-national. And because these women, some of them were identified as women, they were also labeled as transgressive and bad, that is, women who've lost their way. During the anti-CAA protests, while many categories of people, including students and political parties, were termed anti-nationals, Muslim dissenters were especially targeted for hate speech. And their leadership and participation in anti-CAA protests were termed as jihadist conspiracies. Accusations were hurled against them that they were being misled by a group of supposedly anti-national leaders. And this last claim was especially true for Muslim women and students. Now, just a little digression. The anti-national seems to have emerged as a political category now against which hate speech is directed. Now, the anti-national is a category that's been used loosely through history, but it has evolved into a coherent political category since at least 2014, and it's used to characterize any individual who's dissenting against the ruling dispensation. Now, this category may not have any basis in law. That is, anti-national is not defined in any of the laws that that exist in the country, but it has acquired large social legitimation. Like, a lot of people now accept the anti-national as a valid definitive term, and this is this has happened partly because of the way in which news and social media and by public personalities who have repeatedly used this to characterize any dissent. Now, the arrest of human rights lawyers and activists, for instance, in the Bhima Goregaon case, may have little to no basis in existing law. And that has been made amply clear in several writings and arguments made in court, but that arrest has been made socially acceptable to large parts of the public because they've been categorized, these individuals have been categorized as anti-national. Now, coming back to our report, with the eruption of COVID-19 cases in India and the nationwide lockdown, we all started looking at how the media particularly started looking at how the country was dealing with the pandemic. That is until the Tablighi Jamaat cluster in Delhi emerged as a hotspot. Now, this sparked off a fresh wave of communal outrage, which we had seen previously in the anti-CAA coverage as well. And but in this case, in the Tablighi Jamaat cluster reportage, English, Hindi, and other regional media houses were outrightly communal, and they have endangered Muslim communities across the state. And hate speech in this period dehumanized an entire community, made them targets of vigilante violence. And this kind of media reportage also called for social and also led to the calls for social and economic boycott of Muslim communities. And most troublingly, there were also calls for genocide, that is, elimination of an entire community. So we've documented specific trends in reportage in Kannada Media, which I will not go into in detail because of lack of time. But we've seen how individuals have been defamed and belittled. Particularly women are presented as transgressive individuals. In the case of one such individual, this person who was charged with sedition was called as a daughter who has lost her way, who has kicked her father and gotten out of the house. And these kind of gender stereotypes were weaponized against individuals. But with regard to Muslims, there were the entire community during the anti-CAA protests were presented in some channels as being impressionable, as being misled into reporting. And some right-wing individuals we found on TV channels stating that if there are any patriotic Muslims left, they should come out and take a clear stand against the anti-CAA protests. So basically, the media was looking at these people who were protesting and saying that, look, they're not one of us, they're not normal, they're not fully mature individuals. And so um, and somehow delegitimizing their participation in the protests. So we also saw like conspiracy theories being floated that all of these protests against against the CA, NRC, NPR were supported by foreign governments or by extremist governments, and the fact that it was so that fact that the protests were organized and as well as organic was presented as some sort of like a planned conspiracy for to damage the nation. The other trend that you see in TV channels in particular is that a disproportionate space is given to fringe right-wing groups. Now, these are groups that we would not even have heard of before TV channels made their way into our drawing rooms, and they have very little standing in the community in politics, but then they are given disproportionate space. And and in Kannada media, we've seen that some of these people have openly issued death threats against these women who were charged with sedition, and without far from condemning this kind of death threats, channels have simply said that that this person issued a warning to somebody instead of calling it what it is, which is hate speech. Now, there are several other similar such things, but one thing that is that we think is very important to highlight is that anchors are seen inciting disaffection towards justice system in India. So we've often seen, forget the fact that the trial by media does not ask for, ignores basic questions of proof, process, evidence, and law, but they in fact criticize high courts or any other courts who give bails to people charged under sedition or any other legal provisions. So they criticize things like the bail system. They criticize high courts which say that everyone has a right to legal representation, no matter what the crime is or supposed crime is. So in a sense that we are seeing the TV anchors are in particular using a form of hate speech to delegitimize the legal system that is supposed to that has been designed to protect, in some ways at least, those who have been charged with supposed crimes. So we want to, like, our report talks about how all of these instances of anti-CA coverage leads up to the way in which the Tablighi Jamaat cluster was covered, and we talk about how audience was through the course of the anti-CA coverage, audiences were primed in a way to suspend disbelief when the media claimed that individuals and communities were working against the nation's interests. That is, we were primed to believe that yes, of course, there are individuals and communities working against the nation's interests, to absorb increasing amounts of hate and to accept unlawful measures such as stigmatizing individuals, not allowing them entry into public spaces, etc. Simply because it was made into this thing in which it was we needed to do these things to supposedly protect our families, neighborhoods, or villages. So during the Tablighi Jamaat cluster coverage, we saw that hate speech was far more intensely, and the deployment was escalated. It was even weaponized, and the pandemic was communalized. And now media rhetoric regarding the Tablighi Jamaat we've identified as three components. Firstly, the media repeatedly stated or implied that Muslim communities are either solely or mainly to blame for the spread of COVID-19, with many arguing that Muslims were intentionally spreading the virus as a jihad strategy. Secondly, in some instances, media coverage even went one step further and advocated for the economic and social boycott of the Muslim community. And we've seen, at least in Karnataka, one newspaper very blatantly writing an editorial in which they've called for the elimination of bad apples, as they call them. By calling them insects, criminals, rowdies, the media has sought to dehumanize them, and by wildly speculating that they were going around spreading the virus, and sought to present them as barbaric and uncivilized. And by using terms such as Corona Jihad, the Tablighi virus, Muslims across the country were presented as a threat to them, as not just a threat to the nation, but also to the ordinary person, his family, his neighborhood. And this resulted, of course, as we all know, in calls for economic and social boycott of Muslim communities, where people were asked not, general public were asked not to buy fruits and vegetables from Muslim street vendors. Resident Welfare Association began to boycott Muslims in apartments and colonies, and even Muslim volunteers who were providing relief measures to the poor were boycotted or attacked, as in the case of Bangalore, on account of their religion. Now, we've focused, while these were the patterns in media coverage of anti-CAA protests and the Tablighi Jamaat, there are some structural issues as to structural reasons why the media is being the way it is. One relates to the ownership of media, which is now increasingly being concentrated in corporate companies, which have a stake in maintaining the status quo, in furthering the ruling dispensation's ideologies. And so this increased concentration of media ownership among corporate companies or in business families is a matter of concern for all of us who believe in democracy and dissent. The second structural reason is the excessive reliance on advertising as a form of revenue generation. Now, which then generally means that both newspapers and TV channels, news TV channels, cannot really go ahead and criticize or offer differing opinions without facing some kind of vindictive backlash. And a third thing, which is relevant also in other ways to other regional and English media, is a concentration of a certain caste, a certain upper caste concentration within newsrooms, particularly in decision-making levels. Within Kannada Media, for instance, there's one subcaste called the Havya caste, who we see are editors of prominent news channels and newspapers. And while one can't make a very clear connection, can't make a generalized comment about how an upper caste concentration will lead only to certain kinds of reportage, I think it's been very clearly pointed out in several instances how the lack of diversity within caste and gender and other forms of diversity in newsrooms have often led to certain kinds of voices, certain news being given more prominence than those of underrepresented and marginalized communities. Lastly, we have a series of recommendations that we make, and I think I'd like to talk about one small thing in which I think which is relevant for this forum, which is what can we as civil society members do, and the campaign really believes that an informed citizenry is essential, and that an informed citizenry that demands ethical journalism from its media is the real way forward. And one of the things that we've been doing as part of the campaign is to file complaints with not just media regulatory authorities, but with the police, and about about specific TV shows or newspaper articles. And you can have a look at our report to see the various kinds of measures that we as civil society members could undertake. A couple of things that I'll mention is that we need to pressure for more diversity in media and in newsrooms, and we need to undertake surveys on caste, gender, and religious compositions of media houses. Civil society groups should be leading platforms of dialogue across major actors, and but these dialogues must necessarily involve members of affected communities who are brought together to develop ethical guidelines and strategies about how media should report in this time. So that's what I'd like to end my presentation with. If you don't mind, I'd like to just put a link to our report in the chat box. Please do have a look at our report and see. We're a small collective, and we're looking to translate translate this into Kannada. It's in English. It's an English report for now, but we want to reach out to Kannada-speaking publics, and so we would really like if you could read and encourage us by supporting us for translation costs, but also just like sharing the report and telling us what you think about what we've said. Thank you.
Thank you.